What would you do if a total stranger showed up at your door and told you your own sister sent him across the country? To be your husband? Not a letter, not a warning. A man, on your porch, with a hat in his hands and a name you'd never heard. That's exactly what happened to Evelyn Harper. A woman who'd rebuilt her entire life from nothing, trusted no one, and liked it that way. This is the story of the most outrageous proposal in the history of Silver Creek, and the love that nearly didn't survive it. Stay until the very end, because this story will surprise you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and become part of our family. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The afternoon Evelyn Harper's life changed, she was on her knees. Not in prayer. She'd given that up years ago, along with a handful of other things she used to believe in. She was on her knees because a hem wouldn't lie flat, and Martha Bellows had the particular kind of hips that made every skirt in Silver Creek fight back. Evelyn had 3 pins between her teeth, a measuring tape draped around her neck like a noose, and exactly 0 patience for interruption. The knock at the front door came anyway. "1 minute," she called, though it came out more like mumph through the pins. The knock came again, louder this time. Not the polite tap of a customer, something more deliberate. The knock of someone who'd decided they weren't leaving. Evelyn pulled the pins from her mouth one by one, set them in the red cushion on her work table, and stood. Her back ached from bending. She was 31 years old, and her body had already started keeping score. She wiped her hands on her apron, out of habit, not necessity, and walked through the short hallway that connected her workroom to the front of the shop. Through the glass panel beside the door, she could make out the shape of a man, tall, wide shoulders, a hat he was holding in both hands in front of him, turning the brim slowly, the way men did when they weren't sure they deserved to be somewhere. She opened the door. He was maybe 34, 35, dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that looked like it had been used for things jaws weren't designed for, set square against the afternoon sun, weathered in a way that wasn't quite handsome but was difficult to look away from. His eyes were the color of creek water in late October, somewhere between brown and gray, and they met hers without flinching. His clothes told the story plainly. He was a working man, not a merchant, not a banker. The boots were worn at the toe. The jacket had been mended at least twice on the left sleeve. He smelled of leather and distance, the particular smell of someone who'd been traveling for days and hadn't quite shed it yet. "Miss Harper?" he said. "Depends on what you're selling," Evelyn answered. A flicker moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close. "I'm not selling anything." He shifted the hat to one hand and extended the other. "Caleb Rowan, He stopped, started again. "I came from Millhaven." She didn't take the hand right away. "Millhaven's 4 days east. 5, the way I came. Some trouble with a bridge outside Tanner's Crossing." She studied him the way she studied fabric, looking for what wasn't obvious at first. There was no dishonesty in his face, but there was something else, something that looked like a man who'd been rehearsing a speech for several hundred miles and had just now realized it wasn't going to land the way he'd planned. "What brings you to Silver Creek, Mr. Rowan?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Your sister sent me." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. She'd gotten very good at that over the years. But something cold moved through her chest. "Clara." "Yes, ma'am." "Clara sent you." She repeated it like she was testing the sentence for structural weakness. "From Millhaven." "Yes." "And why exactly would my sister send a man I've never met to my front door?" Caleb Rowan took a slow breath. His hat turned one more rotation in his hand. "She asked me to come because she's worried about you. Said you'd been out here alone for—" "I know how long I've been here," Evelyn said. Her voice had gone flat. Not loud, not sharp, just flat, the way a door sounds when it closes on a room with no windows. "Yes, ma'am, I expect you do." "What exactly did she ask you to do, Mr. Rowan?" He held her gaze, didn't look away, didn't look at the ground, didn't do any of the things that would have made this easier to dismiss. He just looked at her square and said it plainly. "She asked me to come out here and, well, she thought you might be willing to consider, and She called it a practical arrangement. She said you needed... He stopped, pressed his lips together, started over with the honest version. She sent me to ask if you'd consider taking a husband. Evelyn stared at him. He stared back. A cart rolled by on the street behind him. Someone called out a greeting to someone else 2 storefronts down. The world of Silver Creek continued its ordinary afternoon without the slightest awareness that something had just detonated on Evelyn Harper's porch. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was perfectly, dangerously even. "She sent you to ask if I'd consider what?" "A husband." He didn't hedge. She had to give him that. "I know how it sounds." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "It sounds insane," he said. "I'm aware." "Then why are you standing on my porch?" "Because I told your sister I would come." A pause. "And because I gave my word, and I don't break it. Even when in hindsight, I probably should have thought harder before giving it." Evelyn said nothing. She was doing the thing she always did when she was this angry, going very still, the way still water looks right before it reaches the falls. "I want to be clear," Caleb said. "I'm not here to pressure you. I'm not here to make demands. Clara, your sister, she meant well. I believe that. But I also understand that you didn't ask for this. You don't know me, and you have every right to close that door. I'm aware of my rights, Mr. Rowan. I know you are. I'm just..." He exhaled through his nose. "I'm just saying that you can. Close it, I mean. I'll tip my hat and I'll go, and you'll never see me again, and your life will continue exactly as it was." "Then why aren't you leaving?" she asked. He turned his hat one final time. "Because I thought I should at least be honest with you first. You're owed that much. A stranger showing up on your door deserves an explanation, and you haven't gotten one yet. You've just gotten the insane part." He paused. "There's more to it, if you want to hear it." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She should close the door. Every sensible, logical, hard-learned part of her brain was writing up the argument. She had built this life without anyone's help. She had come to Silver Creek with $70, a sewing kit, and a damaged heart she'd decided to stop trying to fix. And she had made something real out of nothing. She did not need a husband produced by her well-meaning, meddling sister. She did not need anyone at all. She stepped back from the doorway. "You've got 10 minutes, she said, "and you're not coming inside. Say what you came to say on the porch." But he sat on the edge of the porch railing, not leaning on it comfortably, but perching on it the way men do when they haven't been invited to sit, but also haven't been told to stand. Evelyn stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "How do you know Clara?" she asked finally. It was the question she should have led with. She was still shaken, and shaken made her skip steps. "I worked on a ranch outside Mill Haven for 2 years, he said. "The Hendersons' place. Your sister's husband does some trade with them. Timber, I think. I met Clara at a supper they hosted last fall." He turned his hat in his hands again. Evelyn was starting to think it was less a nervous habit and more how he organized his thoughts. Your sister's the kind of woman who asks questions, real ones, not the polite kind. She's always been that way. She asked me about myself, my plans, where I wanted to end up. He glanced out at the street. I told her I wanted land, a ranch, something I built. I'd been saving for 3 years and I was close, but not quite there yet. And she... He stopped, shook his head slightly. Not at Clara, at something he still hadn't entirely sorted out. She asked me if I'd ever thought about building with someone instead of by myself. I said I hadn't much, not for a while. And she told me about you. Evelyn's jaw tightened. What did she tell you? That you were the most capable woman she'd ever known. That you'd come out west alone and built a business from the ground up. He paused. That you hadn't let anyone close in a long time, and that she thought you were lonely in a way you'd never admit to anyone, including yourself. The words landed somewhere Evelyn didn't want them landing. She had no business telling you that, she said. No, he agreed. She didn't. And yet you came anyway. She said you were stubborn enough that you'd never write a letter or answer an ad, that the only way anyone was going to get through to you was in person. He looked at her. She wasn't wrong about the stubborn part, was she? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself. Sorry. And he did look sorry, genuinely, almost boyishly sorry, the way people look when they've said a true thing at the wrong moment. That came out wrong. She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was slanting in low from the west, the particular golden hour that Silver Creek wore like a dress in late spring, and it caught the dust on his jacket, the tiredness around his eyes. He really had come 5 days through difficult country, for a woman he'd never met, because a stranger at a supper party had told him she needed someone. It was the most absurd thing Evelyn had ever heard in her life. What did you expect? She asked. The question wasn't hostile, it was genuine. When you rode into town this afternoon, what exactly did you think was going to happen? He thought about it. Honestly? Please. I thought you were going to slam the door in my face inside the first 30 seconds. He almost smiled. You've given me considerably more time than I expected. You haven't given me enough reason to slam it yet, she said. Don't take that as encouragement. I won't. She looked out at the street. A woman she recognized, Lucy Pruitt, from the dry goods, walked by and looked over with unconcealed curiosity. Evelyn met her eyes and didn't look away until Lucy moved on. She'd learned that in the first year. Silver Creek watched everything. It would already be talking. If I told you to leave Silver Creek, she said, and never come back, would you? Yes, Caleb said. No hesitation. And if I told you to stay, just for a week, so I could satisfy myself you weren't a lunatic or a thief before I made up my mind? She turned back to him. Then what? Something shifted in his face, not hope exactly, more like the careful way a man looks at solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. Then I'd find somewhere to stable my horse, he said, and I'd ask around town if anyone needed an extra hand. You wouldn't hover. No, ma'am. You wouldn't come to this door every morning making eyes at me. Absolutely not. And you wouldn't talk to anyone in this town about why you're here. He held her gaze. What would you want me to say I'm here for? She thought for a moment. Work. You heard Silver Creek was growing and you're looking for work. That's all. That's the truth anyway, he said. The other part just came with it. Evelyn uncrossed her arms. Not because she'd relaxed, she hadn't, but because she didn't want to look as defensive as she felt. She looked at him for one more long moment. I haven't made any decision, she said. You understand that. I haven't agreed to anything. This isn't anything. I understand. You might be here a week, and I might walk up to you and say, get out of Silver Creek, Caleb Rowan, and you'll go. No argument. You have my word, he said. And the way he said it, quiet, undecorated, the way men say things they intend to mean, made something in her chest do a thing she didn't care for. Your word, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. She stepped back inside the doorway, reached for the handle. Hannigan's boarding house is on the far side of the mill. He's fair with his rates. Tell him the widow Calloway recommended you. She's a regular customer of mine, and Pete Hannigan trusts her opinion. Caleb Rowan stood, put his hat back on his head. It sat naturally there, like it knew the shape of him. Miss Harper, he said. She looked at him. Thank you for the 10 minutes. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment without moving. From the workroom came the smell of fabric and chalk dust and the faint cedar of the drawers where she kept her thread. The same smell that had greeted her every day for 7 years in this building. The smell of the life she'd built, plank by plank, stitch by stitch, out of the wreckage of the one before. She walked back to the workroom. Martha Bellow's half-finished skirt was still draped over the dressing form. The hempins were still in the red cushion. Everything was exactly where she'd left it 15 minutes ago. She stood at the work table for a moment. Then she sat down on her stool, picked up a pen, and went back to work. But her hands, which almost never shook slightly for the first 3 stitches. She pressed them flat on the fabric until they stopped. Outside, Silver Creek went on about its afternoon. Somewhere out there, a man with a mended jacket and a patient face was riding toward Hannigan's boarding house, turning his hat in his hands and waiting to see what she would do next. Evelyn Harper pulled the thread tight and told herself firmly that she did not care. She told herself that twice. The next morning, Evelyn told herself she wasn't watching the window. She was pressing seams. She needed to stand near the front of the shop because the light was better there. The fact that the front window faced the main street of Silver Creek, and the fact that Hannigan's boarding house was visible from a certain angle if you leaned just slightly to the left, these were coincidences, irrelevant ones. At 7:30, Caleb Rowan walked out of Hannigan's front door, settled his hat on his head, and turned right down the street, away from her shop. He didn't look in her direction. He didn't slow down outside her window. He walked like a man with somewhere to be, and within 2 minutes he had turned the corner at the feed store and disappeared. Evelyn set her iron down and went back to her work table. She didn't see him again until Thursday. What she heard, though, that came to her faster than she would have liked. Silver Creek was not a large town, and information traveled through it the way water finds cracks in stone, quietly, thoroughly, without asking permission. By Tuesday morning, Ruth Hannigan, Pete's wife, who made a point of knowing everything, had already mentioned to 3 separate customers at the dry goods that there was a new man boarding at their place. Came from back east somewhere, Ruth had said, which was Ruth's way of saying she wasn't sure and didn't want to admit it. Working man, quiet, pays on time. Evelyn heard this from Martha Bellows, who came back for her second fitting with the energy of someone delivering important intelligence. He's working for the Draper brothers, Martha added, settling her considerable presence onto the fitting stool. Jim Draper said he showed up Monday morning asking if there was any work. Didn't ask what it paid until after he'd heard what the job was. Jim said he liked that about him. She paused meaningfully. You know Jim Draper doesn't say that about anyone. Stand straight, Martha, Evelyn said. I'm just saying. Do you know him? Someone said he mentioned your name. Evelyn slid a pin into place with more precision than strictly necessary. He's a traveler passing through. He knows someone who knows someone. That's all. Martha watched her in the mirror with the look of a woman who was filing information away for later. Of course, she said pleasantly. By Wednesday, Evelyn knew that Caleb Rowan had helped old Douglas Fitch get his wagon wheel back on after it came loose on Mill Road, that he'd eaten both nights at the counter of Pearl's Diner without speaking to anyone more than was necessary, and that he'd spent an hour on Tuesday afternoon sitting outside Hannigan's reading what appeared to be a surveying manual. She knew all of this because Silver Creek told her, not because she'd asked. She hadn't asked about him once. The first time she spoke to him again happened by accident, or close enough to it. She was coming out of the post office on Thursday afternoon with a packet of fabric samples she'd been waiting 3 weeks for, and he was on the other side of the door going in. They nearly collided in the narrow doorway. She caught herself on the doorframe. He stepped back immediately and pulled the door wider. Miss Harper, he said. Mr. Rowan. She gathered herself. The packet of samples was unwieldy, and she'd been juggling it with her other bag, and neither hand was free. Excuse me. Here. He reached for the packet before she could stop him. I've got it. She almost said I don't need help. She stopped herself because she was holding the door open with her elbow and the bag was cutting into her wrist, and saying, I don't need help in this particular moment would have been spectacularly stupid. Thank you, she said instead. He walked beside her to the edge of the post office steps. The street was moderately busy. 3 people she recognized were within easy eye shot. She could already feel the attention, that particular quality of awareness that a small town produces in its residents, the way everyone suddenly finds reasons to look in a direction without appearing to look. He handed the packet back to her at the bottom of the steps. How's the work at the Draper place? She asked, because silence between them in the middle of Main Street was worse than conversation. Something shifted in his expression, barely, but she caught it. He hadn't expected her to know that. It's good, he said. Fence line mostly. Some loading. Honest work. Jim Draper's fair. I figured that out quick enough. He turned his hat in his hands. She'd already started thinking of it as a tell, the hat, and looked at her levelly. How are you? Fine, she said. Then, because it came out shorter than she intended, busy. Spring orders. Right, he nodded. Didn't press. Didn't fill the space with unnecessary words. She'd noticed that about him. He seemed comfortable with silence in a way that most people weren't, like he'd spent enough time alone in wide-open places that quiet didn't feel like something that needed to be fixed. "I'm not avoiding you," she said, and immediately regretted it, because it was the kind of thing you only say when you have been doing exactly that. "I didn't think you were," he said. "You told me you needed time. I'm giving it to you." She looked at him. "You're very calm about all of this." "One of us has to be," he said, and there was something dry in it. Not a real joke, but close. And she felt something in her chest move in a way she didn't immediately have a word for. "I'll be in touch," she said, and picked up her bag and walked back toward her shop. She didn't look back. She was fairly certain he didn't watch her go, but she couldn't be sure about that, and not being sure bothered her in a way she didn't care to examine. That evening, she sat at her work table after closing, not working, just sitting, and she wrote a letter to her sister. She tore it up twice before she got the tone right, and even then it wasn't right. The third version said, "Clara, you had no right. You know that. I need you to know that I know you know that. He seems decent enough, which does not excuse you, and I am not making any decisions, and I need you to stop imagining that you understand what I need better than I do. Your loving sister, Evelyn." She sealed it before she could change it again and walked it to the post office first thing Friday morning. She felt better for approximately 4 hours. What wore it away was not Caleb Rowan specifically. It was Silver Creek. The town had noticed. Of course it had. This was a town where a new hat was worth 3 days of commentary. A strange man from back east who'd arrived with no obvious explanation and was quietly working for the Draper brothers while appearing to have some kind of undefined connection to Evelyn Harper. Silver Creek would be dining on that for weeks. The first person to say something directly to her face was Harriet Oakes, who ran the millinery 2 doors down and had never once in 7 years managed to keep a thought entirely to herself. "Darling," Harriet said, appearing at Evelyn's door on Friday afternoon with a thin pretense of needing thread. "Who is that man?" "Which man?" Evelyn said, though her hands kept moving over the bodice she was constructing. "Don't be coy, Evelyn. It doesn't suit you. The tall one. Dark hair. I saw you talking to him outside the post office yesterday, and he looked at you like—" She paused to find the word. "Like he knew you." "He's passing through," Evelyn said. "He knows my sister's husband." That part was almost true. Close enough. Harriet watched her with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 30 years reading faces across a sales counter. She said, which meant she didn't believe it, but was willing to pretend she did temporarily. "What kind of thread did you need?" Evelyn asked. Harriet bought thread she didn't need and left, and Evelyn went back to the bodice, and Silver Creek kept talking. The thing that nobody expected, but including Evelyn herself, was that Caleb Rowan gave them almost nothing to work with. He showed up, he worked, he was polite, he kept to himself. He didn't drink at the saloon more than an occasional beer. He didn't start anything with anyone. He helped when help was needed and disappeared when it wasn't. Within 2 weeks, Jim Draper had started referring to him simply as "my man Rowan," which in Jim Draper's economy of language was roughly equivalent to a formal endorsement. Old Douglas Fitch, whose wagon wheel Caleb had fixed, stopped Evelyn on the street one afternoon near the end of the second week. Douglas was 73 and had the slightly formal manner of a man who'd been raised to say things directly and had never seen a reason to change. "That fellow Rowan," Douglas said. "You know him?" "Somewhat," Evelyn said carefully. Douglas nodded. "Good man. Helped me with my wheel. Didn't make a performance of it. Didn't wait around for thanks." He paused. Hard to find people like that. Harder than it used to be. He tipped his hat and walked on. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk for a moment after he'd gone. It was a Saturday afternoon, 2.5 weeks since Caleb had appeared on her porch, and the town was in its weekend rhythm. Families moving between shops, kids underfoot, the smell of bread from the bakery drifting down the street. An ordinary afternoon, the kind she'd had hundreds of. She made a decision that she'd been circling for several days. She walked to the Draper brothers' yard. It was at the edge of town, a sprawling operation of lumber and feed and agricultural equipment that smelled of sawdust and iron. She found Caleb at the back, stacking fence posts with another man she didn't know. He saw her before she reached him. He had the kind of peripheral awareness of someone who'd spent time in open country and said something to the other man, who nodded and moved away. He came toward her, not hurrying, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been working hard. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he rolled one of them slightly as he walked like something was stiff. Real work, the kind that leaves marks. "Miss Harper," he said. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. "I can take a few minutes." They walked to the far side of the yard where there was a long fence post lying horizontal, the kind of improvised bench that working spaces always produce. She sat on one end of it. He sat on the other, far enough that there was nothing in the arrangement anyone could misread, though she was aware that if anyone from town happened to glance this way, it would still be read 6 different ways before supper. "Tell me about the land," she said. He looked at her. "What land?" "The land you want. The ranch? Clara said you had a plan." He was quiet for a moment, as if checking whether this was a real question or a test. She watched him decide it was real. "I've been looking at parcels," he said. "Before I came out here, I'd already written to a land agent in this county. There's a stretch about 7 miles north of Silver Creek. Valley land, creek running through it, decent grass." He stopped. "I don't know if you want the specifics or the summary." "Specifics," she said. So he told her. He talked about the land the way people talk about things they've been thinking about in private for a long time. Carefully at first, then with a kind of momentum that built on itself. He'd done the calculations. How many head he could run on that acreage, what he'd need for a barn, how long before it would pay for itself. He'd been saving since he was 26. He was 34 now. 8 years of particular determined saving, which told her something about the kind of man he was more clearly than anything else he could have said. "You could do that without a wife," she said when he paused. She wasn't being cruel, she was being precise. "I could," he agreed. "I could do it alone. It'd be slower, harder, but I could do it." He turned his hat in his hands. "That's not why I came." "Then why did you come, really? Not because Clara asked you to." He was quiet for a moment. The yard sounds continued around them. The thud of lumber, a distant hammering, a horse moving in its stall. "Clara told me about you in a way that made me curious," he said finally. "She said you'd come out here with almost nothing and built something real. She said you were the kind of person who doesn't do anything halfway." He paused. "She also said you'd probably never let yourself want something like what we were talking about. And I thought, I don't know, I thought it might be worth coming out to see if she was wrong about that last part." Evelyn looked out across the yard. "You came all this way on the chance that my sister might be wrong about me." "It sounds worse when you say it like that." "It sounds like what it is," she said, but not harshly. He nodded, accepting that. "I've been alone a long time," she said. She didn't explain why. She didn't offer the story, the one that lived in the part of her chest she kept locked and didn't take out in daylight. She just said it as a fact. "I got used to it. I'm not sure I trust the idea that that's supposed to change." "I'm not asking you to trust the idea," he said. "I'm asking you to trust the person." She looked at him. "There's a difference," he said. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, which didn't need smoothing, but gave her hands something to do. "I'm going to think about it," she said. "That's all I'm offering right now." "That's more than I expected," he said honestly. She walked back through the yard without looking back, and this time she was certain he watched her go, and this time she found that she didn't mind as much as she thought she would. The thinking she'd promised him did not happen in any clean or organized way. It happened the way real thinking always happens, in fragments, sideways, at 3 in the morning when she was lying awake listening to the town settle and in the middle of fitting a dress on the mayor's wife, and while she was eating supper alone on Tuesday night and noticed that the table felt particularly large. She thought about the first man she'd trusted and what that had cost her. She didn't let herself linger there. She'd made a discipline of not lingering there, but she let herself acknowledge it, the way you have to look at a scar sometimes just to remind yourself that it healed. She thought about what Douglas Fitch had said. didn't make a performance of it. She thought about the way Caleb Rowan had sat on that fence post and answered her questions without performing anything, without leaning toward her, without making himself bigger or smaller than he was. She thought about the survey manual Ruth Hannigan had seen him reading, and the 8 years of savings, and the way he'd said, "I'm asking you to trust the person," without any flourish around it, like it was simply the most obvious distinction in the world. On Thursday of the 3rd week, she baked a pie. She was not, in the ordinary run of things, much of a baker. She could do it. Her mother had made sure of that. But she didn't find it satisfying the way she found sewing satisfying, and she rarely bothered. But she had apples that were going soft, and she had the afternoon, and she had the restless, directionless energy of a decision that was forming itself below the surface of her conscious mind. She baked the pie and let it cool, and stood in her kitchen looking at it for a long moment. Then she covered it with a cloth and walked it to Hannigan's boarding house. Ruth Hannigan answered the door with the expression of a woman who had just been given an extraordinary amount of information without being told anything. "Is Mr. Rowan in?" Evelyn asked. "He is," Ruth said. "Would you give him this?" She held out the pie. Ruth took it, looked at Evelyn, showed admirable restraint in not saying any of the 14 things that were visibly passing through her mind. "Of course," she said. "Tell him." Evelyn started, stopped. "Just tell him it's from Miss Harper." She walked home. The evening air was cooling toward genuine spring cold, the kind that reminded you winter hadn't fully released its grip yet, and she walked faster than she needed to. She was halfway through the supper dishes when she heard the knock. She dried her hands and opened the front door of the shop, the connecting door from her living quarters. And there he was, hat in hands, the cloth from the pie folded neatly over one arm. "I'm returning your cloth," he said. "I can see that. It was a very good pie." "Don't make something of it," she said. But she stepped back from the door. He understood immediately. She saw it in the way he moved, that stepping back was not an invitation inside. She was standing in the doorway. She just wasn't filling all of it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. If I said yes, not saying I am, but if I did, what would that look like? What are you actually proposing?" He thought about it. Not performing thoughtfulness, actually thinking. "It would look like whatever we agreed it looked like," he said. "It would start slow. I'd court you properly if you'd allow it, public enough that the town stops guessing, private enough that there's no pressure, and I wouldn't touch your business. Not a decision, not a dollar, not a customer. That's yours. And the ranch. The ranch is what I'm building. You'd be welcome in it. You'd never be required in it." She looked at him for a long time. The street was quiet behind him. The last light had gone out of the sky, and Silver Creek was in that particular hour between dusk and proper dark, when everything looked softer than it really was. "Come back Saturday morning," she said. 8 o'clock. I'll have coffee." Something moved in his face. That same careful thing she'd seen on her porch 3 weeks ago. Not hope exactly, but what hope looks like when it's being kept very still by a man who's learned not to reach for things prematurely. 8 o'clock, he said. "Don't be late." "No, ma'am." She closed the door. She stood in the dark hallway for a moment, her hand still on the latch. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable and inconvenient in her chest, and she pressed her hand flat against it like that would help, and stood there until it settled. Then she went to finish the dishes. Outside, somewhere in the direction of Hannigan's boarding house, Silver Creek was already rewriting the story it had been telling about the quiet man from back east and the woman on her own who needed nobody. It was getting the story wrong, the way it usually did, but this time, for reasons she couldn't quite name yet and wasn't quite ready to examine, Evelyn Harper found she minded that a little less than she used to. He was there at 8 o'clock exactly. Evelyn had been awake since 6. She wouldn't have admitted that to anyone, least of all to him, but the fact was that she'd lain in bed for 20 minutes past her usual rising time, staring at the ceiling and having a very firm internal conversation with herself about what Saturday morning coffee was and was not. It was not a declaration. It was not a concession. It was coffee, extended to a man who had conducted himself with more patience and dignity than she'd had any right to expect, and it meant exactly as much as she decided it meant, and not 1 degree more. She had the coffee ready at 5 to 8, and spent the remaining minutes doing unnecessary things to the kitchen so she wouldn't be standing at the window watching the street. The knock came at 8 on the mark. She opened the door and he was there, hat in hand, jacket brushed clean. He'd had a haircut since she'd last seen him, which was a small thing that landed somewhere in her chest with more weight than it should have. "Mr. Rowan," she said. "Miss Harper." She stepped back and he came in, ducking slightly out of habit. The doorframe didn't require it, but he was the kind of tall that had learned to be careful. He looked around her front room with the contained curiosity of someone who notices things, but doesn't perform noticing. The room was the room of a woman who lived alone and had organized her life around her work. Fabric samples stacked on one shelf, a dress form in the corner wearing something half-built, books on another shelf, not decorative books, red ones with cracked spines, a table with 2 chairs that she almost never used with 2 chairs at it. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get the coffee." She brought it through and they sat across from each other at the small table, and for the first few minutes the conversation was careful. They talked about the weather, which had turned genuinely warm overnight. They talked about the Draper contract. Jim had extended it another 3 weeks, which meant Caleb had more time and more steady income than he'd planned for. They talked around the edges of the thing that had brought him here on a Saturday morning, and both of them knew they were doing it, and neither pushed. It was Evelyn who stopped circling. "I want to tell you something," she said, setting down her cup. "I'm not going to tell you the whole story because it's not yours yet, and I don't know if it ever will be. But I want you to understand why I am the way I am, so you're not operating in the dark." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I was married," she said, "before I came here, back east. I was 23. She looked at her hands around the cup. "He wasn't a bad man. I want to be fair about that. But he thought that a wife was a particular kind of thing, something that belonged to the household and stayed there. And I had this." She gestured slightly at the room, the dress form, the fabric, all of it. "I had this need to make something, to have something that was mine. And he didn't understand that. He thought it was a phase. He thought once we had children it would pass." She paused. "We didn't have children, and it didn't pass." Caleb said nothing. She was grateful for that. "I left," she said. "Which was not what women did. I know that. Clara knows that. My mother, she passed 3 years ago, but she never quite forgave me for it while she was alive." She picked up the cup, set it down again without drinking. "I came out west because west was the direction that felt most like starting over. I had almost nothing. I worked in a laundry for 4 months until I had enough saved to get the equipment I needed. And then I built this." She looked at him directly. "And nobody gave it to me. Nobody helped me build it. And I am not going to let anyone take it apart. Not slowly, not with good intentions, not anyway." "I know," he said. "You say that now." "I know I say it now." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Evelyn." Her name in his mouth, first name, for the first time. She felt it, the small shift of it. "I'm not him. I know that doesn't mean anything yet because you don't know me well enough for it to mean anything. But I want you to hear it anyway. I'm not him." "What are you then?" she asked, and it came out quieter than she intended. He thought about it seriously, like it was a real question deserving a real answer. "I'm a man who spent 8 years working other people's land and thinking about what he wanted his own life to look like," he said. "And the picture I kept coming back to had room in it for 2 people. Not one person and their shadow, 2 actual people." He held her gaze. "That's what I want. I don't want to manage you. I wouldn't know how, and I don't think I'd survive the attempt." That last part surprised a sound out of her. Not quite a laugh, but close. Close enough that she felt it in her throat and quickly smoothed her expression. He saw it. She could tell. He didn't make anything of it. They talked for another hour, real talk this time. He asked about the business, genuinely asked, with specific questions, and she found herself answering in detail, explaining the seasonal patterns of orders, the difficulty of sourcing quality fabric at a reasonable price, the particular challenge of serving a town where half the women wanted the latest fashions, and the other half wanted things that would last 10 years. He listened like someone who was interested rather than someone waiting to speak. She asked about his plans in more detail. He'd made contact with the land agent. The Valley parcel was still available. He'd be ready to put in an offer by late summer if the Draper work continued. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, a rough sketch, done in pencil, of how he was imagining the layout. Barn here, house there, a creek that ran along the eastern edge. She looked at the sketch. "You drew this?" "I draw them every few months," he said with a slight awkwardness that suggested he wasn't sure if that was an odd thing to admit. "It changes. The house keeps changing." She handed it back without commenting, but she'd seen enough. A man who kept redrawing his own future was a man who hadn't stopped thinking about it. That meant something. When he left, an hour and 15 minutes after he'd arrived, they had made no formal agreement of any kind, but he stood in the doorway on his way out and said, "Same time next Saturday if you want." And she said, "I'll let you know by Thursday." And both of them understood that "I'll let you know" was, in her particular language, a very close relative of yes. What came next was 6 weeks that Silver Creek could not decide how to categorize. He came on Saturday mornings. Sometimes they walked afterward, not arm in arm, not the formal promenade of courtship, just two people walking in the same direction talking. And sometimes she showed him the parts of town she knew well, the creek path east of the mill, the view from the low hill behind the schoolhouse. Sometimes they sat in her kitchen, and sometimes, when the weather was good, on the back step that looked out over her small yard where she grew more weeds than flowers, but had never gotten around to caring about it. The town watched. The town speculated. The town did what the town always did. Harriet Oakes declared that it was a serious thing with an air of authority she had not earned. Ruth Hannigan, whose position as Caleb's landlady made her feel she had insider knowledge, told several people that she'd never seen a man more respectful, but that she worried for Evelyn's sake, in a way that was very clearly worry for the sake of having something to worry about. Jim Draper, when asked what he thought of Rowan, said he thought he was a good worker and that whatever else Rowan did with his time was his own business, which was the most dignified response anyone produced, and was therefore given the least weight. The one that hit Evelyn the hardest came from a direction she hadn't expected. His name was Gerald Pruitt, Lucy Pruitt's husband, a man who ran the dry goods with the air of someone who considered himself a community pillar and had the conversational habits to match. He came into her shop on a Tuesday afternoon with the stated purpose of ordering a shirt altered, and within 5 minutes of arriving had managed to work his way to what he'd actually come to say. "People are talking, Miss Harper," he said, from behind the collar of the shirt she was pinning, "about this Rowan fellow." "People talk about everything," she said, adjusting the pin. "This is different." He watched her in the mirror. "He's been here almost 2 months and nobody really knows his business. A man who shows up with no explanation and starts spending time with a woman on her own." He let the sentence arrange itself. "It looks a certain way." She pulled the pin out and replaced it more firmly than the fabric required. "And how does it look, Mr. Pruitt?" "Well," he straightened, "it raises questions about your reputation. I'm sure you understand that. Some of us feel a responsibility, as members of this community." "Hold still," she said flatly. He held still. "My reputation," she said, working along the collar with calm, controlled movements, "has been built over 7 years in this town. It is built on the quality of my work, the fairness of my prices, and the way I conduct my business. It is not built on who I have coffee with on a Saturday morning, and it is not yours to weigh." She finished the pinning and stepped back. "The shirt will be ready Thursday. That'll be 40 cents. Gerald Pruitt left with the shirt and an expression he was working very hard to compose into dignity. Evelyn closed the door behind him and stood in the middle of her workroom and breathed slowly. She was not as steady as she'd sounded. Her hands were not shaking. She had enough control for that. But she could feel the anger in her chest like something pressed against the inside of her ribs. Not just anger at Gerald Pruitt specifically, at the thing he represented. The way a woman on her own was always on loan from respectability, always one sideways glance from losing something she'd worked for. She told Caleb about it that Saturday. Not immediately, not in the first part of the morning. It came out later when they were walking the creek path and he'd asked her something about the week, and the honest answer included Gerald Pruitt's visit. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. She looked at him. She'd expected him to be angry on her behalf or to offer solutions or to say something about men like Pruitt. He'd skipped all of that and gone straight to her. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know I'm not going to hide. I've never hidden." "I know you haven't." They walked for a few steps. The creek was running full from the spring rains, louder than it would be in summer. "There's going to be more of it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably," he agreed. "We could make it harder for them to find things to say, or easier. Depends on which direction you want to go." "What do you mean?" He stopped walking. When she turned to look at him, he was looking at her steadily, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been turning over in his mind for a while. "I mean that right now we're in a middle space," he said. "We're not nothing and we're not announced. And in a small town, the middle space is where gossip lives. People fill in what they don't know. So you're saying we should announce something?" "I'm saying you have options," he said carefully. "I'm not saying what you should do." She looked at the creek. "And if I wanted to take your name?" "Eventually. Not now, but eventually." She said it to the water, not to him, which was the only way she could say it at all. "If I decided I wanted that, what would it cost me?" "Nothing," he said immediately. Then, "I mean, legally, there are things. I looked into it. In this territory, a woman can hold property in her own name after marriage if it was hers before. Your shop, your equipment, your accounts, those stay yours. I'd want that in writing if we did it, for your protection." She turned to look at him. "You looked into it." "I looked into it after the first Saturday," he said. "I wanted to know what I was asking you to risk." She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved. A bird she couldn't name called from somewhere in the willows. "Before," she said. "You said the house keeps changing in your drawings." "Yes." "What does it look like now?" He looked at her, and a careful expression crossed his face. "It's bigger than it used to be," he said quietly. "Has a room off the back that gets the south light." She knew enough about building to know that south light was for sewing. She looked away. The thing in her chest was doing that uncomfortable thing again, and she was less inclined than usual to press her hand against it and wait for it to stop. She let it move for a moment. Let it be what it was. "I need you to understand something," she said. "If I do this, if I decide to do this, it won't be because the town is talking. It won't be to protect my reputation, or because my sister thought I needed saving, or because it's practical." She turned back to him. "It'll be because I decided I wanted it, me, not the circumstances. Do you understand that?" "Yes," he said. "I do. Because the second I feel like I'm being managed into something—" "You'll let me know," he said. Loudly, I imagine. There it was again. That almost smile, that dry thing that wasn't quite humor but lived in the same neighborhood. She felt the corner of her mouth trying to do something and stopped it. "Don't push your luck, Mr. Rowan." "Caleb," he said, the same gentle correction he'd been offering since the second Saturday, and she'd been declining since the second Saturday. "It's Caleb." She looked at him. "Caleb," she said, and watched the word do something to his face that she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just something quiet and real that lasted only a second before he looked back at the creek. They stood there for a minute longer, not saying anything, while the water ran cold and fast over the stones below them, and Silver Creek went about its business in the distance without them. It was 3 days after that walk that everything tilted. It happened on a Wednesday, and it wasn't Gerald Pruitt this time. It was a letter. Not from Clara. Evelyn had gotten 2 more letters from Clara since the first one, both of them carefully worded between apology and hopefulness, and she'd answered both with cautious warmth. This letter came from someone else entirely. From an attorney in Millhaven, writing on behalf of the estate of someone she hadn't thought about in years, her former husband. Thomas Hargrove had died in February. A fever, the letter said. He had listed Evelyn as a contact despite the separation, apparently unable or unwilling to update his paperwork in the years since she'd left. There was no inheritance. They had separated without formalization, and his family had contested any claim she might have had, even if she'd wanted one, which she didn't. The letter was informational, a formality. a closed door on a room she'd already left. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading it. She didn't feel what she thought she might feel. There was grief in there somewhere. Not for the marriage, not for the man exactly, but for the girl who had married him believing it was the beginning of something good. She let herself feel that briefly, honestly, without pressing it away. Then she folded the letter and put it in the back of the drawer where she kept things that needed to be kept but not looked at. She thought about what it meant. Technically, practically, in terms of the machinery of her life, it changed something. The ambiguous legal tangle that had kept her from thinking too directly about formal arrangements was no longer ambiguous. The door that had always existed theoretically at the back of her mind, the one she'd kept herself from looking at directly, was now a door she could actually open. She thought about the drawing with the room that got the south light. She thought about Caleb Rowan saying, "I'm not him," across her kitchen table, and meaning it. She thought about 8 years of saving, about a man who looked into property law before he went courting to know what he was asking her to risk. On Thursday evening, she walked to Hannigan's boarding house. Ruth Hannigan answered the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this visit and was attempting not to show it. "Is Mr. Rowan in?" Evelyn asked. "He is," Ruth said. "Shall I—" "No, thank you. I'll wait on the porch if he's not busy." He wasn't busy. He came to the door 2 minutes later in his shirt sleeves, which was the first time she'd seen him without the jacket, and he looked slightly startled, not unpleasantly, to find her there. "Evelyn," he said. The name was natural now. She'd stopped correcting it after the creak. "Can you walk?" she asked. They walked east along the main road and turned off at the mill path, and neither of them spoke for the first few minutes. The evening was cool and clear, and the sky was doing that particular western thing it did in spring, going pink and gold and then suddenly violently purple before the dark. She told him about the letter. He listened. He didn't fill the silence afterward with the wrong things, condolences that weren't appropriate, questions that weren't his to ask, the kind of crowding that people do when they're uncomfortable with someone else's complicated grief. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. "I'm more all right than I expected to be," she said honestly, which is its own strange feeling. They walked a little further. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "You get quiet when you're thinking. Not your regular quiet, a different kind." He paused. "I've been paying attention." She looked back at the road. The sky was deepening now, the first stars beginning to show themselves tentatively in the east. "The town meeting is Saturday," she said. "The one Alderman Burke calls every spring. The whole town goes." "I know, Jim mentioned it." "I'd like you to come with me," she said, "not to the meeting separately. With me. Together and visibly together, so that everyone in Silver Creek can see it at once and draw whatever conclusion they're going to draw." She paused, writing for a while. "I think today's just the day you let yourself say it out loud." She looked at him. He was probably right. She wasn't going to tell him that. "Saturday," she said, 9 o'clock. Don't be late." "I'm never late," he said. She walked back toward town. The dark was coming in full now, soft and enormous, the way darkness comes in the west where there's enough sky for it to mean something. Behind her, she heard him stand there for a moment before he turned back toward Hannigan's. Silver Creek had no idea what Saturday was going to look like, and for the first time in a very long time, possibly for the first time since she'd arrived in this town with $70 and a sewing kit and the careful, locked-down remains of a heart that had learned to expect very little, Evelyn Harper walked home in the dark and felt something that was not quite afraid and not quite ready, but was, underneath all the caution and all the armor, something that moved in her chest like the first warm morning after a very long winter. Saturday arrived the way important days often do, unremarkably, without any ceremony in the weather or the light to indicate that something was about to shift. Evelyn was up before 6. She told herself it was because she had alterations to finish before the meeting, which was true. But the alterations took 40 minutes, and she'd known they would, which left her with 2 hours and a kitchen that was already clean and a mind that wouldn't stay in one place long enough to be useful. She pressed her good dress instead. The dark blue wool, the one she'd made 3 years ago from fabric she'd ordered specially and saved for an occasion she hadn't been able to name at the time. She'd worn it twice. Once for the mayor's formal dinner, which she'd attended because Mayor Aldridge had asked her to make his wife's gown for it, and the invitation had come with the commission. Once for the funeral of Douglas Fitch's wife, 2 winters ago, because Margaret Fitch had been one of the first women in Silver Creek to bring her real work, not mending, actual dressmaking. And Evelyn had felt she owed her that. She pressed it now with more care than either of those occasions had required, and didn't ask herself why. At 8:30 she put on the dress, looked at herself in the narrow mirror she kept on the back of the bedroom door. She was not a woman who spent a great deal of time looking in mirrors. Vanity was a luxury she'd decided early on not to afford. But she looked now with a kind of assessment. This is what I am, she thought. 31 years old, capable hands, a mouth that goes flat when she's holding something in. Lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting at fine work in insufficient light. Not soft, not particularly gentle. Not the kind of woman who made people want to protect her. She looked at herself until she recognized what she was seeing, and then she turned away from the mirror and went to make coffee. He knocked at 9 exactly. She opened the door, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He'd made an effort too. She could see it. The jacket was his better one, brushed and clean. His boots were polished. He'd shaved closely, which showed a jaw that was more angular than she usually saw under the shadow of stubble. He looked like a man who had taken the morning seriously. "You look," he started, and then stopped himself, like he'd thought better of whatever word was coming. "Don't," she said, not unkindly, just preemptively. "I wasn't going to say anything embarrassing." "You were thinking about it." The corner of his mouth moved. "Maybe." He held out his arm, formal, unironic. "Ready?" She looked at his arm for a moment. It was a simple offer, the kind of thing men and women did walking into town meetings, and it meant nothing except what it meant. She slipped her hand through it, feeling the solidity of his forearm under the jacket sleeve, and they walked off the porch of her shop and into the main street of Silver Creek together, in full view of whoever happened to be looking. Several people happened to be looking. The Springtown meeting was held in the assembly hall behind the schoolhouse, a large whitewashed room that smelled of chalk and old wood and whatever had been cooked in the adjacent kitchen for the community supper that always followed. By the time Evelyn and Caleb arrived, the room was already 2/3 full, chairs scraped, voices overlapped. Children ran along the back wall until someone's mother stopped them. The moment they came through the door together, the specific quality of the noise in the room changed. Not dramatically, not the way it does in stories where everything goes suddenly silent and every face turns. It was subtler than that. A certain hitch in conversations, a redirecting of attention, the almost imperceptible way a room adjusts when something has entered it that changes the calculation. Evelyn felt it. She'd been in this town long enough to feel it. She kept her chin level and her hand where it was on Caleb's arm, and she looked for a place to sit. Douglas Fitch caught her eye from 3 rows in. He nodded, once, with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, and most of them were respect. She nodded back. They sat in the middle of the room, which she'd chosen deliberately. Not at the back, where you could be overlooked. Not at the front, where the gesture would have been theatrical. The middle, where it was simply a fact. Evelyn Harper, and the man she was with, sitting together like people who had every right to be there, which they did. Harriet Oakes, 2 rows ahead, turned around entirely. She was at least honest about it. "Evelyn," she said. Then she looked at Caleb. "And you must be Mr. Rowan." "Ma'am," Caleb said. Harriet looked between them with the expression of someone who has just received exactly the information they have been waiting 3 weeks for and is now figuring out what to do with the excess. "Well," she said, which was not a sentence, and turned back around. From across the room, Evelyn was aware of Gerald Pruitt watching her. She met his eyes without expression and held them until he looked away first. That took less time than she'd expected. The meeting itself was ordinary. Alderman Burke, a methodical man who ran these things the way a clock runs, predictably, without inspiration, but reliably, worked through the items on the agenda. Road repair budget, the question of extending the schoolhouse, a dispute about water rights on the eastern edge of town involving 2 families who had apparently been arguing about it since before either of them arrived and would likely continue arguing about it after both of them were gone. Caleb sat beside her and paid attention, which she hadn't entirely expected. He didn't fidget. When the water rights question came up and the discussion got circular, he leaned slightly toward her and said under his breath, "That's the same argument twice," and she pressed her lips together to keep from acknowledging how accurately he'd identified it. After the formal meeting came the supper, and that was where the real work of a Silver Creek gathering happened, in the press of people around long tables with the noise and warmth that made things easier to say and harder to take back. Ruth Hannigan found them within 5 minutes, with the purposeful navigation of a woman who had decided she was owed a conversation. "I have to say," Ruth announced, settling beside Evelyn with a plate that she wasn't actually eating from, "I think this is lovely. I said to Pete, didn't I say to Pete that there was something there?" She looked at Caleb. "You've been very good for her, Mr. Rowan." She smiles more. "Ruth," Evelyn said, "you do. Ask anyone. I'm asking you to change the subject." Ruth changed the subject to something equally personal, delivered through the medium of community news, and Evelyn bore it with the patience she'd developed over 7 years of being a single woman in a town that found single women both admirable and perplexing. And eventually Ruth was absorbed back into the crowd. "She means well," Caleb said. "Everyone means well," Evelyn said. "That doesn't make it less exhausting." He looked at her with that steady, almost amused thing. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine." "No, how are you actually doing?" She looked at the room, at all the faces she'd known for years, reconfigured by the simple fact of her having walked in beside him. "It's strange," she said honestly. "I thought it would feel worse, walking in with someone. I thought it would feel like I was giving something up." "Does it?" She thought about it. "No," she said, which surprised her slightly even as she said it. "It just feels like walking into a room." He didn't make anything of that, just nodded, like it was information he was filing away. Jim Draper found them toward the end of the supper. He shook Caleb's hand in the blunt way of men who respect each other without ceremony, and then turned to Evelyn with an expression that she'd rarely seen on Jim Draper's face, which was something approaching openness. "Miss Harper," he said, "this man of yours does good work. He's not—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Thank you, Jim." Jim Draper nodded once and moved on, apparently satisfied with the entire exchange. Caleb was carefully not looking at her. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." "I was just going to say that Jim Draper is a man of few words." "No, you weren't," she said. He smiled then, a full one. Not the restrained almost smile she'd gotten used to, but an actual smile. The kind that did something specific to the lines around his eyes, and she looked away before she did something irreversible with her own face. They walked back to her shop afterward in the early afternoon light, and the walk was different from the walk there, less deliberate. The thing that had needed to be done was done, and what remained was easier, the way the air feels after a storm has moved through, cleaned out, with more room in it. At her door he stopped. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can say no." "I know I can say no," she said. "I know you know. I'm just establishing." He turned his hat in his hands. She hadn't seen him do that in weeks, and seeing it now meant something had shifted in him, some version of the nerves he usually kept well managed. "I'm putting in the offer on the land next week, the Valley parcel. The agent says there's interest from at least one other party, and if I wait past Friday, I might lose it." "All right," she said carefully. "I want to take you to see it, before I put in the offer." He looked at her. "I want you to see what I'm building, and I want to know what you think of it. I'm not asking for permission. It's my purchase. But I want your eyes on it before I commit to it, because your opinion matters to me, and because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I've been drawing that house for 8 years, Evelyn, and the version I have now has a room in it that I put in because of you, and it seems like you ought to at least see the land before I go ahead and build your room on it." She looked at him for a long time. "Your room," she said. Not a correction, just repeating it to feel the shape of it. "The room off the south side," he said. "The one with the light." She breathed in, slowly. The afternoon was warm and smelled of recent supper and the particular green smell of a western spring. Somewhere down the street, children were still running the way they do after being cooped up in a hall for 2 hours, burning off energy with pure, joyful pointlessness. "When?" she asked. "Tuesday morning," he said. "I have the wagon from Jim through Wednesday." "I have a fitting at 10, she said. "I know. I meant early. 6:30, 7. We'd be back by 9. She looked past him at the street, at the town that had watched her walk in with him this morning, and was even now, she was quite certain, processing what it meant. She thought about the letter from the attorney in Millhaven, still folded in her back drawer. She thought about the version of herself who had arrived in this town with $70 and decided that survival was enough. She thought that survival had been enough. It had been genuinely enough for a long time. She didn't want to discount that. It had taken everything she had to make it, and she was proud of it, and it was real. But she was thinking, standing on her own porch in her good blue dress on a Saturday afternoon, that maybe enough was not the same as all there was. 6:30 is early, she said. "I'll have coffee," he said. She looked at him. "You'll bring coffee on a wagon at 6:30 in the morning." "From Pearl's. She opens at 6. She considered this. Pearl's coffee was the best in Silver Creek, which was a low bar, but a real one. The fact that he'd thought of it, the fact that he'd pre-solved the 6:30 coffee problem before she'd even agreed to anything, said something about the way his mind worked. Not manipulative, just attentive. The kind of attentive that is actually a form of care. "Tuesday," she said. "Don't be late." "With coffee," he confirmed. She went inside. She stood in her front room for a moment, still in the blue dress, and let herself have the feeling that had been building in her chest all day. Not the anxious version, not the careful locked-down version, but the actual one, which was that she was 31 years old and she had built something real and hard out of nothing, and she was now, possibly, in the very early stages of choosing to build something else alongside it, with someone who had taken the considerable trouble to understand the difference between those two things. It didn't feel like giving up. That was what she hadn't been able to predict. It felt, unexpectedly, like adding. She changed out of the good dress carefully and hung it back up, and went to do the Sunday preparation for the week's orders, and did not let herself think too far ahead. One thing at a time. Tuesday first. The land first. Everything in its order. Tuesday came in cold and clear, the kind of early spring morning that can't decide between the seasons and errs toward honesty. She was ready at 6:20, which was not something she would ever confirm to anyone, and he was at her door at 6:28 with Pearl's coffee and a covered tin pail and an expression that told her he had probably been awake since 5. They drove north out of Silver Creek in the gray-blue light before real sunrise, the wagon moving at a steady pace along a road that turned to a track after the first 2 miles and then to wheel marks through grass after that. Caleb drove without any of the performance that some men brought to it, which was to say, he drove the way he did everything, steadily, without unnecessary motion, paying attention. She held the coffee pail in her lap and drank from the tin cup he'd brought separately and watched the country open up around them. The valley appeared gradually, the way good things often do, not as a revelation, but as a slow unfolding. The land dropped slightly from the track, gentle enough that you only noticed it by the way the grass changed, and then they were in it, a wide-bottomed valley with a creek running its eastern edge, the water catching the early light, cottonwoods along the bank, the whole thing cupped between 2 long ridges that weren't quite hills but gave the impression of enclosure without oppression. It was not dramatic country. It wasn't the kind of landscape that made people stop and press their hands to their chests. It was quiet and wide and particular, the kind of place that rewards looking at over time rather than looking at quickly. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop near the center of it. They sat there for a moment without speaking. A hawk moved in a long, lazy circle above the eastern ridge, which in her experience meant the morning thermals were already building even this early, which meant the valley held warmth well. She noticed that. She noticed the grass, which was the color of things returning, rather than the color of things arrived. She noticed that the creek sound reached them even from here, a low constant movement under the morning quiet. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. He'd learned not to offer it unnecessarily. and walked out into the grass. It came to her boots. It was good grass, the dense kind, not overgrazed, not ruined. She walked toward where she estimated the house would be and turned around slowly to look at the approaches from 4 directions. He climbed down and stood about 10 feet away, watching her, his hands in his jacket pockets. "Where would the barn be?" she asked. He pointed slightly north and east. "And the house?" "Here." He walked to a spot about 30 feet from where she was standing. "This rise." Enough to see both the creek and the road. She walked to where he was standing and looked. He was right about the rise. It was subtle, but it put you in a position to see things coming from 2 directions, which in practical terms mattered, and in less practical terms said something about how he thought. "Show me where the south wall would be," she said. He walked the approximate perimeter. She followed. He talked as he moved, not nervously, but specifically, the way people talk when they're describing something they've imagined so many times it has texture. The kitchen would face west for the evening light. The main room would be wide. The south wall of what he was calling the back room would have 2 windows if the framing allowed, one big enough to work by comfortably. She stood in the approximate center of the approximate room and looked south through the space where the wall would be. "It's good light," she said. "I thought so." She turned around. He was standing at what would be the doorway of the room, leaning against the empty air where a frame would eventually be, looking at her with that open expression she'd been seeing more of since the creek walk. It still startled her slightly, the openness of it. She wasn't entirely sure she deserved to be looked at that way. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not carefully." "All right." "What happens if it doesn't work?" she said. "Not the land, not the business, I mean, us, the thing we're deciding. What happens if we try it and it doesn't work, and we have made formal commitments, and I am legally tied to something that is not what I hoped it was?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then we deal with that," he said. "Together if we can, as decently as 2 people can manage." He paused. "I can't promise you it'll work. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have a guarantee, because that would be a lie, and you'd know it was a lie, and I'd lose whatever I've built with you in the last 2 months." He met her eyes. "What I can promise you is that I'll tell you the truth, even when the truth is hard, even when it doesn't favor me. And I can promise you that the room on the south wall will have the biggest windows I can afford, and whatever you want to put in it will be yours, and nothing in this valley will ever make me look at you like you're a problem I need to manage." Her throat did something it did not have permission to do. She turned away and looked at the creek and composed herself with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing her own responses for many years and was not about to stop. "I need to write to Clara," she said when she trusted her voice again. "Okay." "She's going to be insufferable about this." "Probably." "I'm going to need you to not be pleased about that when it happens." "I'll do my best," he said, and she could hear without looking that he was trying not to smile. She breathed in the valley air, which smelled of new grass and creek water, and the particular cleanness of early morning in open country, and she let herself stand in the approximate location of a room that didn't exist yet, on land that hadn't been bought yet, beside a future that she hadn't decided to believe in until sometime in the last few weeks, without her fully noticing when it happened. "Put in the offer on Friday," she said. He was quiet for a half a second, the way people are quiet when something they've been working toward has just arrived. "Yes," he said. She didn't turn around. "And ask me properly," she said. "When you're ready, don't just assume. Ask me and give me the chance to say yes on my own terms." "I will," he said. "I promise." She picked up the empty coffee cup from where she'd set it on a fence post that hadn't been built yet and walked back toward the wagon, and the morning light was coming in full now from the east, pouring over the ridge into the valley in that particular way that made everything it touched look briefly like the best version of itself. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Well," she said, "are we going back to town?" He climbed up beside her, picked up the reins, and turned the wagon back toward the track. They drove in a comfortable silence that neither of them felt the need to fill, back toward Silver Creek and the ordinary week waiting inside it. The orders, the fittings, the fence work, the accumulated daily weight of lives that were real and imperfect and unfinished. And if Evelyn Harper sat slightly closer on the wagon bench than she had on the way out, She didn't remark on it, and to his considerable credit, neither did he. She still had the letter to write. The one to Clara, that would be different from all the previous ones. Not defensive, not cautious, not the careful diplomatic dispatches she'd been sending from behind her own walls for 2 months. This one would say something true, something she was only beginning to find words for. That the hardest thing she had ever been asked to do was not leave, was not survive, was not rebuild herself from the parts that remained. The hardest thing had been this: learning to want something again, learning to let the wanting be real before she knew how it would end. She didn't write it that night. She wasn't ready yet, but she got out the paper and set it on the table where she could see it, and that was close enough. She wrote the letter to Clara on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the morning in the valley. She'd started it 4 times and thrown away 3 versions. The first was too formal, the language of a woman still managing her distance. The second went too far in the other direction, sentimental in a way that embarrassed her when she read it back. The third was a list of facts, which was accurate but felt like she was filing a report rather than writing to her sister. The fourth one she kept because it started with the truth without making a performance of it. Clara, she wrote, I have been trying to write this letter for longer than I want to admit. The reason it has taken me this long is that I didn't have the right words, and I have never been comfortable sending words that weren't right. So here are the ones I have. You were wrong to send him without asking me. That hasn't changed. But you were not wrong about the thing underneath it, the thing you were trying to say when you didn't know how to say it to me directly. I have been alone in a particular way for a long time. Not lonely, or not always, but alone in the way a house is empty even when it's well-built and warm, functional, decent, but missing something you stop noticing only because noticing it is too uncomfortable to sustain. I noticed it more after Caleb Rowan showed up on my porch and asked me nothing except for the chance to be known. I am writing to tell you that I think I am going to say yes, not because I need saving, not because the town is talking, but because I have spent enough of my life being careful, and I am tired, Clara, not of the work, of the careful. Your sister, Evelyn. She sealed it before the doubt could catch up with her and mailed it the following morning. The offer on the valley land had gone in on the previous Friday as planned. The competing party, a cattle operation from 2 counties west, according to the land agent, had come in lower than expected, and Caleb's offer, which he had structured carefully over several evenings at Hannigan's with what appeared to be a surveying manual and a great deal of arithmetic, had been accepted by Wednesday. He told her over coffee that Saturday, pulling the signed paper from his jacket, with the particular quietness of a man who had been carrying it for 3 days and hadn't wanted to say anything until it was real enough to hold. She looked at the document, his name on it, the legal description of the land, the price he'd paid, which represented 8 years of accumulated work laid down in one transaction. Congratulations, she said. Thank you. He folded it and put it back. Then he looked at her across the table. Evelyn. She knew what was coming. She'd known it was coming since Tuesday morning in the valley when she'd told him to ask her properly. She'd had 3 weeks to prepare for it, which had turned out to be both enough time and not nearly enough time. I know this isn't... I don't have a ring, he said. I wanted to get one, but I didn't know if you'd want me picking it alone, and I thought you'd probably rather have the choice. I would, she said. And I know this is not a conventional... I know none of this has been conventional. No, she agreed. I know you've been careful with yourself for a long time. I know why. I know what it cost you to come this far. He held her gaze with that steady creek-water look, the one that had been harder and harder to look away from as the weeks had passed. I'm asking you to marry me, not to fix anything, not to change what you've built, just to come build something else alongside it, with me, on land that now has your room on it in every version of the drawing that exists. He paused. That's all. That's everything. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Silver Creek was doing its mid-morning business. A wagon on the street, someone calling to someone else, the ordinary percussion of a Saturday. Inside there was just the table and the coffee, and 2 people who had spent the better part of 3 months learning whether this was possible. Yes, she said. No flourish, no tears, no dramatic pause, just the word, said plainly, the way she said things she meant. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding something for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. Yes, he repeated, not to confirm, just to have it out loud between them. Don't make it strange, she said. I'm not making it strange. You're looking at me like that. Like what? Like I've done something remarkable. You have, he said simply. For you, saying yes is the remarkable thing. I know that. She looked down at her coffee. He was right, and she both appreciated it and found it difficult to receive, which was probably something she'd be working on for the rest of her life. I want a simple wedding, she said. No fuss, something small. Whatever you want. And I'll make my own dress. I assumed. And I'm keeping the shop. Evelyn? He said her name with the kind of patience that was not condescension, but its opposite. I know. She looked at him. I know you know. I'm just saying it out loud. It helps me. Then say it as many times as you need to. She said it once more. I'm keeping the shop. Good, he said. And he meant it, which she could tell because Caleb Rowan was not good at saying things he didn't mean. It was one of the qualities she'd come to trust, like she trusted the weight of good fabric. Reliable, testable, consistent under pressure. The wedding was set for June, which gave her 6 weeks, which was not very much time and exactly the right amount. She did not want a long engagement. Long engagements invited interference and reconsideration and the particular kind of social pressure that she had no patience for. 6 weeks was enough to make something real, and not enough for anyone to talk her out of it. Claire's response to her letter arrived 10 days after she'd sent it, by which point Evelyn had already sent a second letter with the actual news. Claire's response to that one arrived a week later and was 3 pages long, twice her usual length, and contained the phrase, I knew it exactly once, which Evelyn had expected, and the phrase, I am so happy for you approximately 11 times, which was more than she'd expected and which she had to read in private because her eyes did something embarrassing. Clara and her husband made the trip from Mill Haven in the 3rd week of May. They arrived on a Tuesday evening with a wagon that included Clara's best linens, contributed as household goods without being asked, and the barely contained energy of a woman who had been right about something important and had shown admirable restraint in not leading with it. Clara was 40, 8 years older than Evelyn, built like their mother had been, solid and capable, with a directness that in other women might have read as severity, but in Clara simply read as honesty. She was at Evelyn's door before her husband had finished securing the horses. They stood on the porch and looked at each other. Don't say it, Evelyn said. I'm not saying anything, Clara said. You're saying it with your face. My face is expressing happiness for my sister, Clara said, with considerable dignity. They held that for a moment. Then Clara pulled her into a hug that was the kind of hug that bypasses every defense a person has built, the kind that knows you from before the defenses existed, and Evelyn let herself be held for a moment longer than she intended. You look different, Clara said when she pulled back, her hands on Evelyn's shoulders, looking at her the way sisters look at each other when they are checking if the person inside the face is all right. I'm the same, Evelyn said. You're not. Your face is different. That's called aging, Clara. It's not aging, Clara said, and left it there. They met Caleb the following morning at Pearl's Diner, all 4 of them, and the meeting was exactly as awkward as Evelyn had anticipated, and then, 20 minutes in, exactly as comfortable as she'd hoped. Caleb shook Clara's husband Martin's hand with the immediate ease of 2 men who worked with their hands and therefore have a shared language, and the conversation between them was underway before anyone had to manage it. Clara watched Caleb across the table with the careful attention of a woman who felt responsible for the outcome and was taking her assessment seriously. Afterward, walking back toward the shop while Caleb and Martin went to look at the land, Clara said, He looks at you like he's paying attention. What does that mean? Evelyn asked. It means most men look at women like they're waiting for a response. He looks at you like you're actually saying something. Clara paused. I liked that about him when I met him in Mill Haven. I was right to think you would too. Don't, Evelyn said. I know, Clara said, and managed to sound genuinely repentant, which was remarkable given how visibly she didn't feel it. The dress took her 4 weeks to make, working in the early mornings and the hour before bed each night. She was not sentimental about it in the way she thought she might be. She approached it the same way she approached any commission, with precision and patience and the particular focused attention that good work requires. But there were moments, fitting it on herself in the narrow mirror, when something crept up on her that she didn't quite have a name for. It wasn't excitement exactly, it was more the feeling of recognizing that something you made with your own hands was the right thing for the moment it was made for. She used white wool chalice, lightweight enough for June, with a simple bodice and a skirt that moved without theater. No excessive trim, no borrowed conventions, something that looked like her. Clean lines, good fabric, made to last rather than to impress. She finished it on a Friday night and hung it on the dress form and stood back and looked at it for a long time. It was good work. She was satisfied with it the way she was satisfied with any good work. Not triumphant, just settled, like a thing had been done right. The morning of the wedding came in warm and blue and indifferent to its own significance, which was the right kind of morning for it. The ceremony was held in the assembly hall, which had been opened and aired and decorated by Ruth Hannigan and Clara and 3 other women who had shown up with flowers and opinions before Evelyn had fully finished breakfast. She had said she wanted simple, and she had meant it, and she held the line on simple, no bunting, no excessive arrangement, flowers from the field rather than ordered from somewhere. The room looked decent and real and like itself, which was what she wanted. The town came. Almost all of it. That surprised her, though she supposed it shouldn't have. Silver Creek had been invested in this story since the morning Caleb Rowan had appeared on her porch 3.5 months ago, and she couldn't reasonably expect them not to show up for the ending. Gerald Pruitt was there, sitting toward the back, with an expression of a man who had revised his earlier position and was trying to carry the revision quietly. Harriet Oakes was in the 3rd row with her best hat and an expression of pure satisfaction. Douglas Fitch sat near the front, straight-backed, with the seriousness that he brought to things that deserved it. Jim Draper came with his wife and both his brothers and shook Caleb's hand before the ceremony with something in his face that looked, on Jim Draper, like emotion, though he would have denied it strenuously. Evelyn walked herself in. She'd told Clara she would, and Clara had argued briefly and then understood. This was not about having someone to hold on to. She was not walking from dependence to dependence, from one person's keeping to another's. She was walking across a room of her own choosing into a life she was choosing, and she was doing it on her own 2 feet because that was who she was, and would continue to be. Caleb was waiting at the front of the room. He watched her walk toward him the way he looked at things he was paying attention to. Steadily, taking it in, not performing anything. He'd gotten a proper haircut. The jacket was new, which she knew because she'd watched him try it on at the general store 2 weeks ago and tell the proprietor he'd think about it, and then go back the next day when he thought she didn't know and buy it. She had decided not to tell him that she knew because some things were better kept. The justice of the peace was a practical man named Howard Tully, who had performed enough weddings in Silver Creek to know the difference between the ones that would last and the ones that wouldn't, and who was apparently making some assessment of his own as he looked between them. The words were simple. She had asked for simple words, and Howard Tully had provided them without complaint. The essential commitment stripped of their excess, the promises that actually mattered said plainly enough that they could be held to. When it was done, and Howard Tully said it was done, Caleb touched her face with one hand, just briefly, the gesture of a man checking that something is real. And she let him. And that was the most intimate moment of the whole morning, more than the words or the witnesses or any of the formal ceremony. Just that. His hand against her jaw for 2 seconds, and her not moving away from it. The town made noise around them that she was only partially hearing. Clara was crying, which was perfectly in character. Martin had his arm around her with the practiced ease of a man who knew when his wife needed steadying. Ruth Hannigan was saying something to someone beside her. Douglas Fitch stood and began to clap, slowly, which was such an unexpected thing from Douglas Fitch that several other people immediately joined in before they'd processed what they were clapping for. Evelyn looked at Caleb through all of this. "Well," she said, the word she always used when she needed a moment. "Well," he said back, "this is very loud." "Small towns," he said. She almost smiled. "We should probably—" "They're expecting the supper." "In a minute," he said. "Just a minute." So they stood there for a minute in the middle of the noise, and she let herself feel it. The full, complicated, imperfect weight of what had happened. Not the version where everything resolved into clarity. The real version, where she was still afraid in the places she'd always been afraid, and still independent in the places she'd always been independent, and still uncertain about 100 things, and also genuinely happy in a way that was new enough that she hadn't finished learning the shape of it yet. That was the part nobody told you about. Not in the stories, not in the way people talked about love and marriage and second chances. Nobody told you that you could be afraid and brave at the same time, that the fear didn't go away when you decided to do something anyway. That courage was not the absence of the thing that scared you, but the decision to move forward while it still had its hands on you. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it before. She'd been through hard things. She'd survived them, rebuilt, made something worth having from the pieces. But surviving alone was a different kind of courage than this. Surviving alone you could do with your eyes closed, with all your walls up, with every door locked. This was the harder thing. Choosing to need someone. Choosing to be known. The supper ran into the evening, and the evening was warm, and Silver Creek ate and talked and celebrated in the way of a town that had followed a story to its end and found the ending satisfying. Even Gerald Pruitt, by the third hour of supper, had managed to produce something resembling goodwill. Ruth Hannigan told the story of Caleb's arrival at the boarding house to whoever would listen, embellishing it slightly each time in the way of someone who has decided they were present at something historical. Douglas Fitch found Evelyn near the end of the evening, when the noise had settled into the comfortable murmur of a gathering winding down. "Miss Harper," he said, and then stopped himself. "Mrs. Rowan." He seemed to taste the new name, checking whether it fit. "I hope you'll forgive an old man his directness." "Always," she said. "That man of yours." He glanced toward where Caleb was across the room talking to Martin, who appeared to be asking him something about fencing. "He reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten, that decent men exist and just need to be in the right place before you notice them." She looked at Douglas Fitch, this old man who had been widowed 2 winters ago and was still carrying it with a dignity that cost him something every day. "Thank you, Douglas," she said, and meant it. They built the ranch over the summer. It was not quick or graceful work. The framing went up in July in 4 days of organized labor. Jim Draper contributed 2 of his men, Douglas Fitch sent his grandson, and Caleb organized it all with the calm precision of a man who had been planning this in his head for 8 years. Evelyn brought food for the work crew on the 2nd day and was thereafter folded into the operation without ceremony, which suited her entirely. The room on the south side was framed last, on the 4th day, in the long light of a July afternoon. She stood inside the rough framing while the walls were still just timber uprights, the future windows just open spaces, and she could feel the direction of the light, the way she'd learned to feel fabric, by standing in it, by paying attention. "Well," Caleb said from the doorway. "The east window needs to be bigger," she said. He looked at the framing. "I can do that." "I know you can," she said. He made it bigger. By October, the ranch house was livable, not finished, nowhere near finished, with bare plank floors and walls that needed more work, and a kitchen that had the bones of what it would become, and not yet the flesh. But it was livable, and they lived in it, moving out from Silver Creek on a Saturday, in the last warm week of the year, the wagon loaded with her sewing equipment and her books, and the dress form and 2 chairs from her kitchen table, because both of them were attached to those chairs in the unreasonable way people get attached to objects that have been present for important moments. She kept the shop. She drove in 3 mornings a week, and sometimes 4, and the orders didn't slow. If anything, the fact that she'd married and moved to a ranch outside town had made her a more interesting subject of conversation, which somehow translated into more commissions. Silver Creek logic. She'd stopped trying to understand it. On a morning in late October, nearly 8 months after a stranger had knocked on her door with an impossible message, she sat in the south room of the ranch house with the early light coming through 2 windows, one of which was, as she'd requested, larger than originally planned, and worked on an order for the mayor's wife, who wanted something for the holidays and had, as usual, changed her mind 3 times about what that something should be. The ranch was quiet around her. Outside, she could hear Caleb somewhere in the direction of the barn, a distant sound of work, of things being built and maintained. of someone present without being intrusive. She found, as the weeks had passed, that she had become surprisingly comfortable with the sound of another person nearby. Not dependent on it, just not opposed to it, the way she'd always been before, which was its own kind of change, the quiet kind, the kind that happened below the surface of your conscious attention and only became visible when you looked for it. She thought about the girl who had arrived in Silver Creek with $70 and a sewing kit and a heart she'd decided to keep closed, and she tried to find the place in herself where that girl still lived. She was still there. She hadn't gone anywhere. She was in the hands that moved over the fabric with the same precision they'd always had. She was in the mouth that still went flat when something was being held in. She was in the independence that had survived every challenge this territory had offered and had not been diminished by this, would not be diminished by any of it, but there was more room in her now. That was the only way she could put it. More room. The letter from Clara arrived that week. Her sister had gone back to Millhaven in August, satisfied in the particular way of people who have done something they believed in and had it work out. This letter was lighter in tone than their earlier correspondence. Less careful, more like the way they'd talked as girls, before the years of distance had made them formal with each other. Near the end of it, Clara had written, "I want to ask you something and you can tell me it's none of my business. Are you happy? Not content, not managing, not fine, actually happy?" Evelyn read that paragraph twice. She looked up from the letter at the south window, at the valley going gold in the October light, at the creek just visible along the eastern edge of the property. She heard Caleb come in the back door, the particular sound of his boots, which she'd learned without meaning to, and heard him stop in the kitchen, and heard the sound of him not coming to interrupt her because he'd learned when she was working and that it mattered. She picked up her pen. "Yes," she wrote. "Not perfectly. Not without effort. Not in a way that means I've figured anything out or stopped being afraid of things. But yes. Actually, yes. I didn't know if that was still possible for me. It turns out it was. It turns out the most dangerous thing I ever did was not leaving Thomas, not coming west alone, not building the shop from nothing. The most dangerous thing I ever did was open the door to a stranger and give him 10 minutes on my porch. Everything after that was just deciding, one day at a time, that the wanting was worth the risk. I love you, Clara. I'm sorry it took me this long to learn how to say that properly. Evelyn." She sealed the letter and set it aside to mail in the morning. Then she picked up her needle and went back to work, in the room with the good south light, on the ranch that was being built from the ground up, by two imperfect people who had both waited long enough to know that patience was not the same as giving up, and that the bravest thing a person could do was not fight harder, or hold tighter, or survive longer, but simply choose, and mean it, and show up for it the next day, and the day after that, without knowing how it would end, because that was all there ever was. And it turned out, enough.